Hey everyone, Lightning4554 here, and I'm so glad to be back and making this video. I've got some good news for Soundworks. They finally added all the samples from Perfect Drums, and we can finally use it in Soundworks. So to give some context to the people that may not have seen my original video of Perfect Drums versus DW Soundworks, I'm going to give you a brief recap about what happened. So about 10 months ago, give or take, Roland bought out Naughty Seal Audio, who was the makers of Perfect Drums. And Perfect Drums was a sample library that many people found very useful and enjoyed for things like metal, pop punk, djent, and a couple of other of the heavier genres of music. After being bought out by Roland, they decided to use this technology in partnership with DW, which is another brand that Roland now owns, and make a new software that they labeled as the spiritual successor to Perfect Drums, going as far as to even calling it Perfect Drums 2. However, once the software was released, it was kind of a letdown for a lot of people, and a lot of people did not like what they had done to the previous version of Perfect Drums. People like myself and a lot of the comments in the original video felt as though the punch and the pizzazz that Perfect Drums had was just no longer there. Everything felt very drum machine-like. It felt a little bit too raw, and it did not deliver the same kind of sound as Perfect Drums once did. However, to counteract this, Naughty Seal Audio / Roland had sent out an email to all their customers telling them that they were going to import all of these samples from the previous version of the software to the new version of the software. And it seems about 9 months after that whole debacle happened, it seems like they finally have kept their promise. So all this to say, we now have a brand new expansion, and the latest expansion for Soundworks is all of the samples culminated from Perfect Drums imported into Soundworks, and it is now called Metal Legacy. The Metal Legacy sample set includes every single sample from Perfect Drums and a few extras, actually. So before we start getting into a full mix review, as well as how the sounds differ and some interesting things within the sound samples themselves, let's quickly go ahead and look at the sample choice that we get between both Perfect Drums and Soundworks. Here on your screen right now, you're going to see the sample choice selection for both. Coming from Perfect Drums, you will notice that there is different labeling of cymbals as well as different labeling of splashes, and certain things have been moved around, as well as toms have been split into a couple of different sections in Soundworks as opposed to how it is normally split in Perfect Drums. As well, there is an entirely different name for a certain section that used to be called bell in Perfect Drums, but now in Soundworks, it is now called effects. There was 2 bell cymbals and there was 1 jam block from Pearl. So in total, you have 3 sample choices here. But now if you come over to Soundworks and you look at the stack section, this is where the 2 bells have been stored. They are the same exact bell samples. But now these bells are in a different category that is now named stacks, which includes 2 stacks from a different category. So certain things have been moved around in terms of cymbal selection for Perfect Drums in Soundworks. And to go back to the effects tab, this is where we get an additional 2 types of instrument selection. We first have cowbell choice, which features 6 new cowbells in the instrument choice, and the jam block that we were missing from the stacks page. Personally, I think this is already a great addition to what was already a very good sample selection back from Perfect Drums and now given to DW Soundworks. As well, you can notice that there is another section called Snare 2. However, there's nothing currently available in Snare 2. Maybe later down the road, we might see something added into this section, but I wouldn't hold my breath. So after trying to find more differences between the 2 softwares and how they imported each sample, I noticed something. Certain instruments like the snare and the ride have additional articulations. The snare has additional cross sticks and has an additional way of triggering what is called solid, which is essentially the same as a rim shot. And the ride has a new edge sample, which is basically when they hit the edge of the cymbal and it makes a more washy sound compared to a more pingy sound like that of the bow or the bell. And to further touch on the cowbell section that we now have, each of them have two articulations each, which would be edge and the center of the cowbell. So with the addition of the cowbells and these new articulations for certain instruments, you might be asking how much bigger the sample set has gotten from Perfect Drums, and I'm here to say it is not as big of a change as you might expect. You're not going to need to go out and buy a whole new hard drive like how you had to do with the original Soundworks expansion libraries, because those were huge per kit, and this one stays fairly true to Perfect Drums with just a little bit more storage. Perfect Drums takes up about 7.4 gigabytes of storage, and this new Metal Legacy expansion is said to take about 9-ish gigabytes of storage. This overall makes it so that the footprint of both of them is still fairly similar. Of course, when you have extra articulations as well as extra instruments added, there's going to be a bit of a difference, as well as the coding and the way the round robins are laid out in each sample library. So spacing is going to be a little bit different, but overall, this is very true to the original, and I'm really glad about that. All right, let me talk to you about a small change that has happened and occurred in Soundworks. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to keep in mind when switching between the both of them. All right, so here in front of me, I have the MIDI of the groove that I played in front of you for both Soundworks and Perfect Drums. And the difference that you'll probably notice isn't huge. Not necessarily a big difference. However, if you look right here, these are two splash cymbal hits that in Perfect Drums I had to switch around because the MIDI mapping for certain things is fairly different in each library. Another thing that is different in Soundworks from the original Perfect Drums is the layout of the toms. In Soundworks, you have these two for one tom, you have these next two for another tom, and then you have this one for another tom. And that in Perfect Drums is a little bit different. That is to simulate left and right hits for each tom, which is really good because that helps you with realism, especially if you're trying to do very fast fills with a drum set, especially if you're doing something like grindcore where it's very much like the drums are going to sound fake, but you need to add some more realism, or for metalcore that's very fast, or deathcore. But in Perfect Drums, you only have A, G, and F. These three notes are the only ones, because if you try going a little bit up above that, you have nothing on B, you have a crash on C, and on D, you also have another symbol. And of course, with the addition of some samples, things like C sharp are now cross sticks, which this was not anything in Perfect Drums before. All right, so now that we're done talking about some of the MIDI mapping settings, let's get to the good stuff. All right, so I wrote a track that's about 2 minutes long, and the first test is going to be Soundworks, and the second one is going to be PD. You can make up your mind about which one you like more, but I'm going to give my thoughts at the very end. All right, so after hearing the full mixes, you'll notice that there is a bit of a difference in terms of especially cymbal sound in each library. PD seems to have a lot quieter of cymbals, which I did not change. In that mix, I only used the emo wet preset from Metal Legacy in Soundworks and used the perfect kit number 7. To quickly give a little bit of context here, PD had always had these presets here, which were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 12. And all of these kits had their own unique sound, own unique way that they use the samples. And what they did in Soundworks is that they gave name to some of these kits. So if you come here to the presets, you'll notice that all of them start with ML and then an underscore and then the actual name. And they have two versions. They have a dry and a wet version. So there's 90s rock, country core, emo, well, gently, emo dry, emo wet, garage metal, punch, modern punch, pop punk, power metal, radio rock, and all these other different ones here from the Metal Legacy library. Now, if you go and you try going in order of the presets, you'll notice that they don't exactly line up. But for example, if you listen to the snare on this preset and this preset, you'll notice it uses the exact same snare. Currently, right now, I have no processing. This is an entirely new project after that other project that we were just in when I showed you the full mixes. This project has absolutely nothing. I just routed out some of the instruments into their own respective channels, and you're going to see something really nifty here with an EQ trick that I found out. When we heard that full mix, you may have noticed that PED lacked a lot of cymbals, and I think that's something very, very prominent throughout the library as a whole. PD has never had the most realistic symbols, and it's never had the most prominent of symbols. What people really liked about the sample library was mainly the shells, at least in my opinion. Here in Soundworks, it seems that they have reworked the way the cymbals and the shells sound. The shells here seem to be sampled with the effects knob turned on. Now, what do I mean by this? When we come over to PD, if I go to snare and you look at the snare, there is a knob called effects. And the effects knob was something that a lot of people really enjoyed because the effects knob basically brought in a triggered sample as well as more compression and a couple of other things. I don't remember exactly what it was, but just a couple of other things. However, here in Soundworks, we don't really have an effects knob. We do have effects themselves. However, if you notice something about each of the effects here in DW Soundworks, you'll notice that a lot of these effects are completely turned off. The way you engage a effect here in Soundworks is by hitting this little blue button right here. And this little blue button shows you that it will be on, and when you click off of it, it will remain with a blue circle showing that it's still on. However, we're getting a very similar sounding snare from both, even though there is no effects knob. So, what does that necessarily mean? To me, it seems as though there is baked in effects already to the samples. So, we're not getting straight raw samples here. But besides the fact that we aren't getting raw samples, I still think this sounds fairly good and I'm fairly surprised by it. Also, if you want to see something that's very nice and very touching, the CPU usage for both of these kits is about the same. If you are coming from my other video, you may remember that the CPU usage of a standard DW Soundworks library was far more aggressive than that of a Perfect Drums kit. However, by using these samples and the Metal Legacy samples specifically, you are really cutting down on CPU usage, and that is amazing. Because of this cutback in CPU, I feel more inclined to use DW Soundworks as a daily driver for drums as opposed to something like Perfect Drums because I feel like I get a more natural sound and a natural response out of some of the samples here in Soundworks. But that's going to be a thought that I touch on a little bit more in the final. So moving on, we're going to each listen to these kits back to back with the same samples on this specific preset and how it really interacts and what you can expect from some of the other presets here in this Metal Legacy expansion. So, in terms of samples on an individual level, they sound great, and you can hear a minute difference between the two. Now, let's say if I go to a groove, and a groove that is a little bit more dynamic and not as heavy hitting as some of the other grooves that I've shown, what would that sound like? Now, if this is anything to go off of, when I hear this, I hear that Perfect Drums sounds a bit more artificial sounding whenever there are ghost notes involved in its programming. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing for some people. But the one issue that remains prominent is that compared to Soundworks, Perfect Drums sounds a little bit muffled in comparison. So let's see what happens if I was to, let's say, just come over to my mix and go ahead and add an EQ plugin in front of Perfect Drums that just slightly boosted the high end where the cymbals lie. Now, how would that sound? Isn't that cool? I just put a high shelf on an EQ plugin and Perfect Drums is starting to sound closer to Soundworks. However, you'll notice that the ghost notes on the snare drum aren't as articulate as in something like Soundworks. That is a big distinction between these two. Well, anyway, I think this video is long enough, and I believe that this was long overdue for Roland and DW to step up their game a little bit and finally keep that promise that they made a while back. I'm really glad that they kept this promise, and it really feels like they actually cared about the users of the old Perfect Drums. Now, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I actually prefer the way these new samples are sounding in terms of the new mixing that they did, as well as how they sound with a bit more articulate programming than that of Perfect Drums, as well as having the addition of the cowbell samples along with some extra articulations like a cross stick. This has made Soundworks something that I can actually see as a really good upgrade for somebody. Remember that as a old PD user, you had a discount. So yes, you do have to pay a little bit extra to do this upgrade, and it's not necessarily a free upgrade. However, realize that when you buy the software, you're not buying just the Metal Legacy expansion. You are also then getting several other expansions that come with it, and any expansion that basically comes out in the future. I don't know if they will be paid for, and I don't know if they'll be free, but it seems like Roland and DW have been keeping up the pace of giving us free expansions and free updates for this software for the time to come. In the end, you have to remember that Soundworks was also made for the DWE kit, which is a very expensive kind of boutique electronic drum kit. And of course, those other sample libraries are not going to be for everybody. But because of the fact that you're getting more choice, now you can mix and match with the old legacy samples and now use them in the brand new software as well. Of course, certain problems like the program using lots of CPU with the newer samples, as well as it crashing every now and then, as well as the transportation of samples being a little bit finicky to work with, especially here in Windows, can sometimes be a little bit of a drag. But once you get everything figured out, and especially if you know how to deal with it, it becomes much more worthwhile in the end. So anyway, I hope you guys had fun with this comparison between the two. And I hope you guys can share your thoughts in the comments like we did in the other video. We had so many people who shared their opinions and I loved reading all of them. And I even made a lot of comments myself on that video. And fun fact, yes, this video was made because of a commenter. I'll put them up on screen right now. Thank you for commenting this because I wouldn't have known that this was already out if I hadn't seen this comment. But take care of yourselves, everybody, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.